The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. Crazy Horse's surrender at the Red Cloud Agency in May of 1877 marked the closing chapter of the Great Sioux War. In this episode, we explore how Lakota political traditions and the pull of family and community shaped his path from resistance to entering reservation life, revealing the decisions behind a defining moment in American history. Today, we explore the 1998 Nebraska History magazine article, Crazy Horse and the End of the Great Sioux War, written by Kingsley M. Bray. As the new grass greened the northern plains the first week of May of 1877, events signaled the end of Indian resistance in the Great Sioux War. On May 7th, Colonel Nelson A. Miles dealt a decisive blow against Lame Deer's village, the last group of Sioux to try and maintain the old nomadic life in the Lakota hunting grounds of the Powder River country. 250 miles northward, where the invisible medicine line of the 49th parallel offered a haven from U.S. military pursuit, a larger body of Sioux followed Sitting Bull into exile into Canada. And far to the south, thousands more Sioux and Cheyennes succumbed to the inevitable and surrendered at the garrisons of the Sioux Reservation. The mass capitulations climaxed on Sunday, May 6th, when Crazy Horse, the greatest Lakota warrior leader of his generation, led his village into Red Cloud Agency and symbolically surrendered 3 Winchester rifles. The Sioux War was over. A wealth of Indian territory exists that enables us to understand the Great Sioux War from Indian perspectives. Sioux and Cheyenne combatants and their relatives who served as Army Scouts or acted as peace negotiators have left a vast body of source material from which we can reconstruct Indian motivations. Some of these accounts are the result of military debriefings within weeks of the events which they describe. Others are recollections recorded by the pioneer historians of the Indian Wars early in the 20th century. Like all historical sources, they need rigorous evaluation and careful weighing to detect bias and inconsistency. The special problems posed by translation must always be borne in mind in Indian history. In this article, we shall attempt to formulate an Indian perspective on the late stages of the Sioux War, and in particular to trace the processes and events that led to the surrender of Crazy Horse on that distant spring afternoon. Other authors have addressed late phases of the Sioux War from a military perspective, or attempted to understand something of the complexities of Indian politics in both the agency and non-agency camps. Here, the use of previously untapped documents, viewed through the prism of Lakota political organization and kinship networks, aims to create a perspective from within the Crazy Horse village, and to map more closely than ever before the sequence of events as they unfolded week by week, until surrender became inevitable. The Sioux War of 1876 and 77 grew out of years of mounting frustration between the United States and the hunting bands of Sioux and Northern Cheyennes, who roamed the Powder River country between the Black Hills and the Bighorn Mountains. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills powered high command voices that wished a military solution to the quote-unquote Sioux problem. After the hunting bands declined to report to the agencies of the Great Sioux Reservation, where a majority of the Sioux already lived, the Army was turned loose in the spring of 1876. To a centennial nation's bewilderment, the coalition of Sioux and Cheyennes responded by defeating the forces of General George Crook at the Battle of Rosebud on June 17th, and barely 1 week later, annihilating the immediate command of Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer on the Little Bighorn River. For several critical weeks, the stunned columns of Crook and of Custer's superior, General Alfred H. Terry, lay becalmed at the base camps, freeing the Indian coalition to move off after Buffalo. By midsummer, that coalition numbered upwards of 1,000 lodges, housing 6,000 people and at least 1,500 adult males. About one half of this number, the winter roamers, lived in the hunting grounds year-round, shunning the reservation and its culture of dependence. Each spring, they were strengthened by the arrival of the summer roamers, bands that spent the cold months at the agencies, drawing rations with their reservation kin. At the head of the coalition stood two leaders of outstanding character and ability, with keen strategic insight and total commitment to the hunting life. Sitting Bull, a holy man of the Hunkpapa division of Sioux, and Crazy Horse, war chief of the Ogalallas. Together, these two leaders had worked hard to foster a spirit of solidarity and total rejection of reservation life, and to forge an autonomous tribal identity for the disparate hunting bands as a new Sioux division, the Northern Nation. By fall, the Northern Nation could no longer remain united, however. Typically, this was a season of dispersal, as game became scattered. Summer roaming bands usually drifted into the agencies ahead of the cold weather, and with the regrouping of the demoralized columns of Crook and Terry, the coalition finally faced a slow, dogged pursuit. Faced with these realities, the coalition gradually broke up into 4 blocks. By late November, these blocks were occupying distinct districts and pursuing different strategies regarding the war. Farther south was the main Cheyenne village, at least 183 lodges. Having made fall buffalo hunts in the upper Bighorn Valley, it had retired to winter quarters in the southern reaches of the Bighorn Mountains, probably hoping to sit out further military operations. Farthest north, Sitting Bull's Hunkpapas and their associates, aggregating about 230 lodges, had gravitated beyond the Missouri to attempt trade both at Fort Peck and with the Canadian Métis. Although no Hunkpapas provided peace negotiations with the Americans, a minority favored a complete withdrawal from the war zone. 57 lodges, led by headmen Iron Dog, Long Dog, Little Knife, and Lodgepole, had crossed into Grandmother's Land, the British possessions of Queen Victoria, early in November. There, they could make fall hunts without further interference and plan cold weather operations secure from pursuit. Largest of the blocks was that of the Minneconjou and the Sans Arcs. Even after the modest surrender at Cheyenne River Agency following negotiations and hostage-taking by Colonel Nelson A. Miles, this village counted perhaps 380 lodges. It also remained deepest divided over the issue of war. Although its leadership forbade further surrender at the agencies, by early December a strong peace movement favored reopening talks with Miles, possibly to explore his floating the idea of relocating their home agency from the mouth of the forks of the Cheyenne River, nearing the hunting grounds in the Black Hills. Locating close to Miles's headquarters at the junction of the Yellowstone and Tongue Rivers, this village was attracting moderates from Crazy Horse's Ogalallas. The Crazy Horse Village, comprising about 250 lodges of Ogalallas, Brules, straggling Cheyennes, and others, was located in the middle Tongue River Valley. Crazy Horse, 36 years old and utterly fearless, was the inspiration of the battlefield. His bravery in the Custer battle was already legendary. His generosity, mysticism, and normal peacetime reserve lent him the charisma of enigma. As Ogallala war chief, Crazy Horse was in tight control of his village through the Akecheta police, which enforced council decisions. During the fall, as news from the agencies dwelled on pony and arms confiscations, the arrest of incoming hostiles, and the surrender of Lakota rights to the Black Hills and the Powder River country, Crazy Horse's rhetoric had hardened against capitulation to the Americans. The council passed a ruling that no movement be permitted to the agencies. Akecheta leaders were entrusted with punitive powers to enforce the order, empowered to beat offenders, destroy their property, and kill their horses. Concerned at the potential fragmentation of the coalition, Crazy Horse sent runners to arrange talks with Sitting Bull. But the first big army victory of the war forced a new process of reconsolidation. On November 25th, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie's command surprised the Cheyenne village in the Bighorns, killing over 40 people and driving half-clothed survivors into the frozen Wyoming mountains. The Cheyennes, suffering terrible hardships, moved north to contact Crazy Horse's village. On December 6th, the ragged vanguard of Cheyennes found the Ogalallas encamped high up on Beaver Creek, an east tributary of Tongue River barely 6 miles from Miles Tongue River cantonment. The Ogallala reception of the defeated Cheyennes was controversial. According to Wooden Leg, he said, quote, The Ogallala Sioux received us hospitably, but they had not been disturbed by soldiers, so they had good lodges and plenty of meat and robes. They first assembled us in a great body and fed us all we wanted to eat. To all the women who needed their food, they gave a supply. They gave us robes and blankets. They shared with us their tobacco. Gift horses came to us. Every married woman got skins, enough to make some kind of lodge for her household, end quote. Wooden Leg's account typifies one pole of Cheyenne opinion. Significantly, he belonged to the winter roamer Cheyennes and lived in a small kindred that had spent all fall with Crazy Horse. Young Two Moons, another warrior belonging to the non-agency Cheyennes, also remembered that the Ogalallas fitted out the refugees with, quote, lodges, robes, and pack saddles, and fitted them out well, end quote. On the other hand, Cheyennes with stronger ties to the agency told a less favorable story. Crazy Horse, quote, received them with very slight manifestations of pity, end quote, as reported Cheyennes who were surrendering the following spring. They continued, quote, and they made them feel that their presence in his camp was only tolerated and not desired, end quote. Arapaho chief recalled the Sioux, quote, gave the Cheyennes nothing, end quote, and forcing them to trade for a few small lodges that they received. And Little Wolf, a principal chief of the Cheyennes, singled out Crazy Horse himself as without compassion for the refugees. A rather complex process was clearly at work. After initial feasting in Crazy Horse's village, Ogallala compassion quickly became selective, targeting at non-agency Cheyennes. Black Elk's recollection that Ogallala men, quote, went from camp to camp to collect clothes and teepees for the Cheyennes, end quote, indicates that the Akichita became the main channel of redistribution. Akichita donors would seek to bind Cheyenne recipients to agreeing to the no surrender line. Indeed, in intertribal councils, the Sioux recognized Black Moccasin and his nephew, Ice, as principal Cheyenne leaders, marginalizing the position of such moderate leaders as Dull Knife and Standing Elk. Crazy Horse seized upon the Cheyenne disaster to reinforce his anti-agency ideology. 150 Indian scouts enlisted at Red Cloud Agency had led Mackenzie to the Cheyenne village, a point not lost on hardliners. Moreover, the reinforcements brought by the Cheyennes encouraged Crazy Horse in a growing conviction that he need not sit out the war. The war chief had already sent runners to invite Sitting Bull back to the hunting grounds south of Yellowstone. Alone among the Northern Nation leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse grasped the strategic challenge posed by Miles. Miles's plan was to isolate the Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse groups, then break them piecemeal. Both chiefs sought to keep the two wings of the Northern Nation close enough for ready communication. The Hunkpapa chief had spent a few days of intensive trading with the Métis, but on December 7th, he recrossed to the south side of the frozen Missouri, heading toward a new rendezvous with Crazy Horse. With his column was a train of mules packing 50 boxes of fixed ammunition, the fruit of the Métis trade. Nevertheless, Sitting Bull could not dictate to his followers, and even as he turned southward, a further 52 lodges led by Black Moon, White Guts, and Crawler opted for refuge in Canada. The 109 lodges now in Grandmother's Land constituted almost half of the non-agency Hunkpapas. Sitting Bull remained in control of the main Hunkpapa village, 122 lodges, but on December 18th, Lieutenant Frank D. Baldwin caught Sitting Bull unaware near the head of the Redwater Creek. The Hunkpapas scattered over the frozen plains between the Missouri and the Yellowstone. Although he captured the camp and seized vital winter supplies, Baldwin failed to inflict casualties or to capture the ammunition pack train. By the last days of December, the Sitting Bull village was regrouping on the lower Powder, but the time lost in refitting prevented the rapid journey to Crazy Horse that the Hunkpapa chief had planned. The Crazy Horse village had by this time received other reinforcements. On December 16th, 5 headmen from the Minneconjou Sans Arc village were shot down by Crow Army scouts as they approached Tongue River Cantonment to reopen talks with Miles. The peace movement was immediately discredited, and the village leadership resumed total control. This leadership was vested in 4 chiefs known as deciders, who were granted temporary control of the village. Spotted Eagle of the Sans Arcs was the principal chief. His fellow deciders were Red Bear, another Sans Arc, and the Miniconjou Lame Deer and Black Shield, four the most vehement opponents of agency life. Ignoring placatory messages from Miles, the deciders ordered the village to leave the Yellowstone Valley immediately. They hurried southwest to join Crazy Horse, finding the Ogalallas and Cheyennes in a new wintering site just below where Hanging Woman Creek joins the Tongue. By about December 20th, 4 villages, roughly equal in size, were established at Hanging Woman: Ogallala, Cheyenne, Miniconjou, and Sans Arc. Numbering over 800 standard lodges, this massive winter gathering included most of the summer strength of the northern nation, since significant defections had been prevented by the Soldiers' Lodge. White Eagle, a headman related to one of Miles's hostages, had made several attempts to leave the Sans Arc village with his 4 lodges of kin, but each time Akichita drove him back. Crazy Horse again seized upon the killing of the peace talkers to swing moderate opinion behind his war front. Vowing revenge upon the Crows, he personally scouted Tongue River Cantonment, but found Miles had dismissed the offending scouts. He returned to Hanging Woman to plan a more ambitious campaign. He proposed to take the offensive, crush Miles, and win back the hunting grounds of the northern nation. By the last week of December, the strategy had taken shape. 50 Ogallala and Cheyenne warriors were sent to harry the cantonment and draw Miles up the Tongue into a massive ambush to be staged somewhere in the upper valley. Always a precarious tactic, the decoy plan depended on careful coordination. To ensure surprise, the Soldiers' Lodge even tried to keep the plan secret from the women. The last thing Crazy Horse needed was village dissension. When a new peace movement emerged in the Miniconjou and Sans Arc villages, he moved swiftly to nip it in the bud. The peace party grew in response to the arrival, about December 23rd, of 2 delegates from Cheyenne River Agency. The envoys were Important Man, a Miniconjou headman and brother to hostage Bull Eagle, and Fool Bear, a Sans Arc. They carried tobacco from Lieutenant Colonel George P. Buell, commanding the post overseeing Cheyenne River, but his terms were flatly unconditional. Surrendering parties must give up all horses and arms. The delegates' candid account of the military takeover on the reservation caused much unease, some listeners declaring, quote, they would never submit on such terms as long as they live, end quote. At councils and feasts held throughout the villages, the delegates found that the, quote, Sans Arcs and Miniconjou were disposed to listen to a little kind talk from us, but the Cheyennes and Ogalallas would not listen and abused us very much, end quote. Red Bear, the Sans Arc decider, chided them with American bad faith. Quote, my friend, we sent a man, your own brother, to the whites to see on what terms they would let us come in. But they have kept hostages in prison and sent you here and want us to come in and deliver ourselves up to release them, end quote. The delegates also spoke to Yellowgrass, a holy man who claimed to be in, quote, constant communion with the spirit of General Custer, end quote, even taking his Lakota name of Longhair. Yellowgrass had access to sources of ammunition, for he was conjuring cases of the stuff at night feasts. Speaking as a former moderate converted to the war faction, he said that he had been, quote, a great friend of the whites, living around the traders a great deal in the old times. But now I see they are determined to destroy all our peace and happiness, and my advice will be to my people, as long as I live, never to submit to the whites, end quote. As this council closed, Important Man and Fool Bear went to visit the families of the hostages. Suddenly, Crazy Horse appeared. Without constituted authority in a private lodge outside his own village, the war chief warned the delegates that they, quote, would never be allowed to take anyone from that camp. If any left, they would be followed and killed, end quote. His willingness to claim authority beyond the Ogallala village demonstrated his determination to preserve the war front at all costs. The decoy party was now en route to Tongue River Cantonment, and Crazy Horse would not tolerate desertions. Nevertheless, the delegates continued to whittle at Miniconjou Sans Arc solidarity. About December 25th, they slipped out of the village after nightfall with 13 lodges. Quote, we got quite a ways, supposing we had got away, when all at once Crazy Horse appeared with a good many warriors, who shot all of our horses, took our arms and knives, and all of our plunder. and then told us if we wanted to go to the whites to go on, but the snow was so deep we could not travel without horses, and we had to return to the hostile camp, end quote. The following day, undaunted, the delegates sought to secure village consensus for a daylight departure. At least 150 lodges, almost one-half the strength of the combined Miniconjou and Sans Arcs, were now willing to leave for Cheyenne River, perhaps alienated by the high-handed manner adopted by Crazy Horse. But when the Akecheta deployed in force, quote, and told us no Indians could leave that camp alive, end quote, the movement petered out. Akecheta speakers ordered Important Man and Fool Bear to leave the village. They departed, but returned singly by night to toll away 4 lodges, close relatives of the hostages. As an indicator of the way the wind sat in the Miniconjou village, Headman Spotted Elk sent word by the delegates, quote, that he would like to come in if his horses and arms would not be taken from him, end quote. Meanwhile, the decoy party had reached Miles's post. On December 26, they drove off 150 head from the beef contractor's herd. Miles was quite as determined as Crazy Horse to end the war swiftly. His column of over 400 infantry began the march up Tongue River on December 29th, exchanging gunfire with the decoys on January 1st and 3rd, 1877. On January 6th, as the column approached Hanging Woman Creek, it passed the just deserted village sites. The ambush plan called for the villages to move higher up the tongue toward the Bighorn foothills, where a surprise attack would be easier. The fragmentary Indian reports and oral histories indicate that dissension continued to threaten the unity of the war front. Upon striking the lodges, part of the Indians headed up Tongue River. Part ascended Hanging Woman. Crazy Horse's Ogalallas and most of the Cheyennes, including war leaders Ice and Two Moons, were with the Tongue River group, clearly the core of the war faction. Smaller numbers of Cheyennes and other Sioux took to the Eastern Trail. When Miles's scouts captured a small party of Cheyenne women and children on January 7th, however, the two groups hurried to reunite on the Tongue. Disagreement continued on how to free the captives. The Cheyenne White Frog recalled that a party of Sioux, quote, went back to meet Miles and to fight or make peace, end quote, perhaps reflecting an uneasy compromise between war leaders and moderates. The party attempted no negotiations, however, took 100 warriors engaged in a spirited skirmish at dusk until darkness, and several artillery rounds dispersed them. That night, Akecheta meetings backed Crazy Horse's demand for a full-scale assault on Miles, but disagreements continued. Some argued that the decoys should continue their operations until Miles entered the Broken Country. Others argued an immediate ambush between Miles' present camp at Belly Butte and the breaks of Wall Creek. Crazy Horse clearly favored the latter option, and early on January 8th, he led out some 500 warriors, about half the total force, identified as Ogalallas and Cheyennes. The rest, evidently a majority of the Miniconjou and Sans Arcs, stayed behind. Perhaps angrily, Crazy Horse, quote, directed the Indians to go down and meet Miles or else move camp, end quote. The Battle of Wolf Mountains opened as war party organization collapsed, and a rush of warriors alerted Miles that he was under serious attack. Crazy Horse and the other leaders, fellow Ogallala Little Big Man, Hump, a Miniconjou Akecheta leader strongly identified with the Ogallala war front, and the Cheyennes Ice and Two Moons, sought to control the assault by dividing the force. Ogallala warriors took the west side of the Tongue River, and Cheyennes attacked from the east. Crazy Horse had his pony shot from under him in one charge. The leaders signaled maneuvers on shrill eagle-bone whistles, but despite the spirited attack, the warriors could not dislodge Miles from his defensive positions, especially when his artillery began to find the range. As afternoon drew on, a blizzard arose, forcing the Indians to disengage and withdraw upstream. 4 warriors, including Crazy Horse himself, performed as rear guards, while the main party retreated. As the warriors engaged Miles, the villages pressed on up the Tongue, marching through the night and the next day before relocating in a strong defensive position on January 9th. Here, at the junction of the Tongue and Prairie Dog Creek, near the modern Montana-Wyoming boundary, the rear guard returned on January 10th to report that Miles had turned back to the cantonment. Miles's withdrawal gave the villages time to regroup and muster resources. Scouts brought still more good news. Buffalo were plentiful some miles below, and the jubilant hunters were able to concentrate on making surrounds to replace depleted stores and horse meat rations. The presence of game relieved the pressure of the war front, temporarily silencing voices that urged negotiation and surrender. The villages were now grouped into two equal-sized clusters, probably one of Ogallala's and Cheyennes, and one of Miniconjou and Sans Arcs. 1 week after Wolf Mountains, the war front received another fillip. Sitting Bull made his delayed arrival on January 15th with about 100 Hunkpapa lodges, the ammunition pack train, and a fund of scare stories from the agencies. Immediately, morale was revived in a fury of feasts, dances, and councils. Quote, the heralds harangued through the camp, directing all the Indians to get themselves in good condition for fighting, saying, you see, by going to the whites, you will be put in the guardhouse and held prisoner, end quote. Sitting Bull presided over the distribution of the ammunition, as well as blankets, beads, and tobacco at village giveaways. Eagle Shield reported, quote, I got some of the cartridges and also some tobacco. I got about 30 needle gun cartridges. Others got more than I did, end quote. Eagle Shield's grandfather, Miniconjou Decider, Black Shield, was glad of the revival of the war spirit, stating, quote, he wants to fight. He wants war, end quote. Others were able to use Sitting Bull's ammunition to further the war front's aims. The holy man, Yellowgrass, revived his night rituals, conjuring up no less than 10 boxes of cartridges at one meeting. Yet Sitting Bull's arrival posed new questions for the northern nation. What was the coalition's long-term strategy? Did it intend to try and remain in the Lakota hunting grounds this year, despite the certainty of renewed campaign in the spring? At Inter-Village Council, Sitting Bull declared his intentions to return north of the Missouri to trade again with the Canadian Métis, and to induce the Red River Indians to join the hostilities. Carefully worded, this plan left open his subsequent intentions, a return to the war zone or regrouping in Canada. Although Sitting Bull remained committed to maintaining the coalition, many Hunkpapa headmen were becoming convinced they should join their relatives in Grandmother's Land. Four Horns, Hunkpapa chief, and Sitting Bull's uncle most clearly articulated this view. However nuanced, Hunkpapa opinion was united on a bottom line: no negotiations with Americans, no surrenders at the agencies. Contrasting with Hunkpapa unity, the Miniconjou and Sans Arcs remained deeply polarized over these issues. The village leadership was committed to keeping up the war, but of the deciders, only the Sans Arc Spotted Eagle supported a move to Canada. A number of lesser headmen and war leaders, notably the Miniconjou's Flying By and Red Thunder, and the Sans Arc Turning Bear, drew closer to Spotted Eagle over the issue. Still, other headmen favored peace talks. Eagle Shield, who deserted the village about January 17th, summed up their mood after he arrived at Cheyenne River Agency, stating, quote, many would come in now if the Indian soldiers would not prevent them. They do not want to fight and see more war. I heard they were willing to make a treaty provided they can retain all of their country and the whites will move out of it, end quote. One of the key players in the reemergence peace party was Miniconjou headman Red Horse, a brother-in-law of Crazy Horse himself. Recalling a visit to Cheyenne River with its regular rations and security, Red Horse spoke up in open council and, quote, told Crazy Horse in presence of his soldiers that he recognized the United States as his great father, end quote, conceding the U.S. government a kinship status denied by hardliners. In his experience, he continued, the whites were, quote, ready to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, end quote. Other peace proponents were leaders who had fled Cheyenne River Agency after the military takeover to preserve their pony herds from confiscation. They included Miniconjou Spotted Elk, his brother Touch the Clouds, and their relative Roman Nose, and White Eagle of the Sans Arc. All feared pony and arms confiscations, but all agreed that Canada held no attractions. Their stipulation that peace must entail American withdrawal from the hunting grounds was unrealistic, but may have been floated to bring on board hardliners who supported the war, but did not seriously consider exile in Canada. The Peace Party had numbered 150 lodges of Miniconjou and Sans Arc in late December. Regrouping after Wolf Mountains, it was finding new support in the hitherto united Ogallala village. On January 16th, 2 Brulés, Charging Horse and Make Them Stand Up, were sent to Spotted Tail Agency to get the news and to ask that Brulé head chief Spotted Tail, quote, go there to them with tobacco, end quote. They were to state that Spotted Tail's people and theirs were, quote, one and the same, end quote, and assure agency chiefs and army officers that a peace embassy would net large-scale surrenders. Just what body authorized these messengers is unclear. Since it was clearly not any of the hardline village organizations, they were probably deputed at the feast of moderate headmen held in a private lodge. Brulés were certainly present, and later action of Touch the Clouds and Roman No suggests that they also may have sponsored the message. Spider, an Ogallala headman and half-brother to agency head chief Red Cloud, may have also been represented in the talks. Thus, by late January, 2 opposing strategies were cohering. One rejected all U.S. dialogue and favored regrouping in the safety of the British possessions. The other urged peace talks through reservation intermediaries. Together, the 2 factions probably accounted for only half the total strength of the Sioux in the Tongue River villages. Crazy Horse himself, together with almost all Ogallalas and Cheyennes, plus significant numbers of Miniconjou and San Arcs, belonged in neither faction. For them, continued occupation of the Powder River hunting grounds remained the prime objective. Crazy Horse had never visited the agencies, rejecting all invitations to counsel with reservation leaders. He realized that surrender would constitute a political minefield for any northern leader committed to maintaining a position independent of the agency hierarchy. Canada, however, offered no solutions. The country north of the Missouri had been opened to Sioux expansion by the Hunkpapas. Sitting Bull's people would claim primacy in dealing with Canadian officials, marginalizing Ogallala leaders. Hence, Crazy Horse's determination to maintain the northern nation in its traditional hunting grounds. Despite enjoying greater initial support than other factions, Crazy Horse's position gradually became untenable. Serious cracks were now appearing in the Ogallala front. On January 24th, a minor headman named Red Sack unexpectedly found himself invited to the Ogallala Council teepee. The councilors formally deputed him to go immediately to Red Cloud Agency, hitherto entirely off limits, quote, to ascertain how matters were and to return and let them know as soon as possible, end quote. Red Sack's mission represented a radical departure. Unlike the 2 Brulé messengers, Red Sack formally represented the Ogallala Village organization. It is impossible that the mission had the backing of Crazy Horse, but elders and moderate leaders such as No Water may have pressed the issue until the war chief withdrew opposition to preserve solidarity. About the same time as Red Sack's departure, one even more controversial took place. Some 15 lodges of Brulés, Ogallalas, and Miniconjous slipped away to surrender at Spotted Tail Agency. Led by Eagle Pipe, a Brulé, and the Ogallala Spider, they had made an earlier attempt to leave, but had their arms and ponies confiscated by the Akichita. Relatives secretly outfitted the party with 54 horses and a handful of guns. After eluding detection, they headed east, their tiny procession floundering through the deep snows. Within a day or so, further defections revealed the depth of the crisis faced at the war front. At the Soldiers' Lodge feast, Red Horse told Crazy Horse to his face, quote, I was going where the whites lived and would give myself up to them. I told him he must not send his soldiers to intercept me. Better for his cause if he did not, for there are many of his own people who are like me, end quote. Crazy Horse offered no immediate objection, but Red Horse and his supporters had learned the lessons of December and laid careful plans. Both Red Horse and White Eagle visited the teepees of their personal followings, advising them to steal away at night and to rendezvous on Powder River. A few lodges slipped away, evidently including the kindred of Spotted Elk. Red Horse was successful in invoking his relationship as brother-in-law to Crazy Horse, meeting no resistance as he departed about January 28th. But as White Eagle's womenfolk completed their packing, Crazy Horse led, quote, about 100 of his soldiers and surrounded my camp. Some of them dismounted, entered our lodges, and took our guns. I was very angry then at the soldiers and pulled down my lodge and started right in the face of them. They shot down 2 of my horses, but I moved on, end quote. Altogether, some 39 lodges, 229 people left with the 3 headmen for Cheyenne River Agency. So far, the desertions were small scale, but stark realities meant that the massive winter gathering on Tongue River would have to break up. Even in bountiful summer, such a huge camp could not remain together long. In winter, the scattering of game dictated dispersal. The Hunkpapas were keen to move north, and about January 25th, Sitting Bull led some 50 lodges out of the camp. Although many Hunkpapas continued to press for immediate retreat into Canada, Sitting Bull did his best to maintain coalition solidarity. He announced that he would camp at the forks of Powder River, and he and Crazy Horse agreed on a later rendezvous at Blue Earth Creek, an east tributary of Lower Powder. Final decisions about the increasingly divisive issue of Canada could wait until then. The breakup only encouraged more waverers in the Ogallala village. White Eagle Bull, with another man and another woman, left on January 26th. 5 lodges of Brulés left on January 29th, both parties bound for Spotted Tail Agency. In a final attempt at enforcing martial law, Crazy Horse's police deployed on February 1st to prevent the departure of leading Cheyenne chief Little Wolf. In an angry scene, Little Wolf defied the Akechita, who confiscated or killed 11 of the Cheyenne ponies and pressed on with his 4 lodges for Red Cloud Agency, swearing vengeance on the Ogallala war chief. The policy of soldiering that have effectively controlled the Crazy Horse village for almost 6 months was clearly breaking down. In the face of a growing peace party that tacitly favored opening negotiations, continued soldiering could only rupture what remained of village solidarity. Crazy Horse's actions after February 1st show that he understood this and moderated his opposition to the peace party. His decision reflected political realities, but it is tempting to speculate that Crazy Horse had reached a critical point in his life. By nature reserved, even diffident, the soldiering may have become an intolerable burden to the war chief, initially necessary to maintain unity, but increasingly coercive and resented by the ordinary people. Faced with Soldiers' Lodge rhetoric about punitive surrender terms, waverers could point to the pony and arms confiscations carried out by their own Akechita as scarcely less harsh. As Northern Nation unity cracked, Crazy Horse became increasingly confused over mapping and concerted strategy. Within a few days of Sitting Bull's departure, another 150 lodges of Hunkpapas, Sans Arcs, and Miniconjous started to join him at Powder River Forks, following Spotted Eagle. Early in February, most of the remaining Miniconjous and Sans Arcs, about 200 lodges, drifted uncertainly in their wake. The Ogallalas and Cheyennes remained together, but now scouts reported buffalo herds in the Bighorn Valley. A move west after game would compromise Crazy Horse's ability to reunite with Sitting Bull, precisely the opportunity Miles would exploit in breaking the coalition. Crazy Horse continued to favor a move east to counsel with the Hunkpapas at Blue Earth Creek, perhaps citing reports of buffalo even farther east on the upper Little Missouri. All other Ogallala and Cheyenne leaders urged the Bighorn option, and Crazy Horse found himself without support. About February 3rd, the main village moved west into the Bighorn Valley, about 350 lodges strong. Their number included perhaps 30 lodges of Miniconjous in Sans Arcs, following Hump, who chose to stay with the Ogallalas. Only a small cluster of lodges remained on the tongue. The majority of these, about 20 lodges of Ogallalas and Brulés led by No Water, and 30 of Cheyennes following headman American Horse, Red Owl, Tanglehair, and Plenty Camps, evidently turned south toward Upper Powder, ultimately bound for surrender at Red Cloud. Crazy Horse was left with only his own kindred group, some 10 lodges strong, composed of his closest relatives. This kindred was one of 3 that composed the Hunkpatila band of Ogalallas. The disillusion of the Hunkpatila illustrates well the divisive situation facing Crazy Horse. A second kindred led by his father's brother, Little Hawk, remained with the main Ogallala village, while the third, led by his uncles Iron Crow and Running Horse, perhaps followed Spotted Eagle to seek refuge in Canada. No acrimony seems to have been involved in the division of the village. Soon, Crazy Horse's tiny camp moved east across the snowy ridges into the Middle Powder Valley. His objective thus remained rendezvous with Sitting Bull, but now alarming news arrived from that quarter too. On February 7th, the Hunkpapas broke camp at Powder River Forks, bound for immediate refuge in Canada. Perhaps Sitting Bull left only after learning of the Ogallala move west, thinking Crazy Horse had given up the rendezvous plan. Once beyond the Yellowstone, other Hunkpapa leaders forced the pace, crossing the frozen Missouri on February 15th, 20 miles above Fort Peck. But in a mirror image of Crazy Horse's actions, Sitting Bull himself butted off the main village with 10 lodges, stalling on the headwaters of Big Dry Creek. There, Sitting Bull monitored the back trail, still seeking to maintain a chain of camps linking his followers with Crazy Horse. But his position was plain: regrouping of the coalition in Canada and only an indefinite return to the homeland. Crazy Horse must have been bitterly disillusioned when Sitting Bull's runner found him. As the unity of the northern nation irretrievably broke down, it seemed that the homeland was now his sole burden. With a divided people and a dual threat from military action and the subtler compromises of negotiation, Crazy Horse was unsure how to formulate a new strategy for preserving the hunting grounds. Such a strategy would have to encompass the previously unthinkable, that the remnant northern nation could no longer resist the blue-coated troops it had so comprehensively defeated not 1 year before. Psychologically, Crazy Horse seemed unable to summon the reserves of willpower that had driven him through the winter to maintain the war front at all costs. He drew back from the spiral of punishment imposed upon his own people and withdrew into a caricature of his normal peacetime diffidence. As the late winter wore on, Crazy Horse turned increasingly for guidance to the holy men of his band, preparing himself to undergo a vision quest that he might beg the powers of the universe for guidance in this deepest crisis of his life and of his people. Meanwhile, at base camps becalmed by winter, army commanders prepared a new diplomatic offensive against the northern nation. From Tongue River Cantonment, Colonel Miles dispatched his half-Sioux scout, Johnny Brugier, and Sweet Taste Woman, one of the Cheyenne captives, on February 1st. 300 miles southeast, the White River agencies were the scene of intense talks between General Crook's subordinates and the reservation chiefs. Courted by Crook, Spotted Tail declined to lead an embassy north until unconditional surrender terms were relaxed. But at Red Cloud Agency, Crook's proposals met with a warmer response. The Ogallala Agency had long been perceived as a trouble spot, but a younger generation of Ogallala leaders were determined to improve its image and to forestall government proposals to remove the reservation Sioux to Indian Territory. Many had already served as scouts in Mackenzie's winter campaign. When Major Julius W. Mason, commanding Camp Robinson, asked for delegates to go north, 30 men volunteered. Representing all of the agency Ogallala bands, their leader was Hunts the Enemy, a nephew of Red Cloud himself, and an Akichita leader in his Bat-Face band. Equipped with tobacco packages and presents for the northern chiefs, Hunts the Enemy's party set out on January 16th. They were beset by Cheyenne horse thieves and morale problems, and made slow progress until they crossed the Belle Fourche on February 8th. There, they met Red Sack's small party, bound for the agency. Red Sack's report seemed to have galvanized the delegates, for they now made good progress through worsening conditions. Passing down the thickly snowed valley of the Little Powder, the party cut the trail of 40 lodges heading east. These were the tracks of the camp of Red Horse, Spotted Elk, and White Eagle. These people had met as planned on Powder River. Detailing one man to follow up the trail, Hunts the enemy continued down the Little Powder. As they neared its mouth, they, quote, met 3 Indians who told them that Crazy Horse was encamped some little distance above on Powder River, and that Sitting Bull was just below the mouth of Little Powder, end quote. Deciding that their Ogallala relatives were their priority, the delegation swung up the valley of Powder River. About February 11th, as they approached the mouth of Clear Creek, the delegates made out through the thick bottomland timber a small cluster of 10 teepees. It was Crazy Horse's camp. The delegates were kindly received, they later reported, in deep contrast to Crazy Horse's reception of earlier envoys. Many people in the camp were their relatives, and the 30-man party numbered about twice the strength of the tiny camp. After the feast of welcome, a herald called a formal council. There, Hunts the enemy and other speakers presented the Army's terms of surrender at the agencies. The delegates reported their speeches were not immediately responded to. Etiquette prescribed that messengers sleep as the host village after making their proposal, leaving the camp council to debate the issues and reach a decision. In a small camp on such a matter, all adult males with a war record would participate in the council. Red Feather, Crazy Horse's younger brother-in-law and comrade, remembered clearly his kinsman's mood, stating, quote, Crazy Horse did not want to go to the agency. He did not answer them for a long time, end quote. Indeed, the second council called the following day was an exercise in stalling. Crazy Horse was surprisingly gracious, saying that the delegates, quote, were relations and should be friends, end quote. After the pipe circulated, he said, quote, the smoke was good. He did not commence the war. His relations were at the agencies. He could send for all the Northern Nation Indians to let them decide what they could do, that if he told them to stay, they would do so, even if they were to die. But he would let them say, end quote. Politely, Crazy Horse declined to open the delegates' tobacco. He told Hunts the enemy to take it to the main Ogallala village in the Bighorn Valley. Whatever their decision, he reiterated, he would do the same as the others did. After a couple of days of talks, the delegates divided. Some, including Crazy Horse's relative Tall Man, stayed in the war chief's camp. Others started for the agency. Only 4 pressed on to the main Ogallala village. Hunts the enemy himself, Running Hawk, a brother of agency Ogallala chief Young Man afraid of his horses, Long Whirlwind, formerly an Akachita leader in the Oyupe band with relatives in the northern Ogallala village, and the Cheyenne Sioux Firecrow. Although mounted on fresh horses from Crazy Horse's own herd, the going was bad, and the delegates took 3 days to reach Tongue River. Finally, they located the Ogallala Cheyenne village on Rotten Grass Creek in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Uproar seized the village, and warriors raced out to meet the 4 delegates, leading them to the council teepee. After a brief talk, the delegates were dismissed to private lodges. They learned that Miles's envoys had already opened negotiations. A deputation of 29 men, chiefly Cheyennes, but including the Miniconjou Hump and 3 other Sioux, had left for Tongue River Cantonment with Bruguier and Sweet Taste Woman 5 nights before. Little else reassured the 4 delegates, and they spent an anxious night. So fearful were Longwind and Firecrow that they decided not to attend the big council called the next day. Only Hunts the enemy and Running Hawk entered the great council teepee and sat before the circle of Ogallala and Cheyenne leaders. After the pipe had passed, an Ogallala Akachita arose and ordered Hunts the enemy to speak. The delegate stood and addressed the council, stating that he was sent by General Crook himself. Crook's message was that the Great Father in Washington wished all wars between Indians and whites to end. All the Ogallalas should live, like the agency bands, in peace. The northern bands should come to Red Cloud Agency, where, quote, there shall be nothing untoward done to them, end quote. The Akachita now ordered Ogallala elder Ironhawk to respond, quote, but speak as we said to speak only, end quote. An accomplished orator and camp herald, Ironhawk had been entrusted to articulate the consensus position reached by the council since the delegates' arrival. Ironhawk ordered Hunt's the enemy to carefully hearken as he sat. He reviewed the intrusion of Americans into Lakota hunting grounds and the resulting war. If, however, the Great Father was serious in wishing peace, he said, quote, "He shall have it, for I am the very one who, when someone tries to outdo me in being agreeable, I always win. So I shall move camp and approach Red Cloud Agency. But I am burdened down with much meat. I am heavy. There is much snow. All of the rivers lie across my road, and they are deep. I must travel slowly, so hunts the enemy. Before I arrive, you shall come to me again, or else send your men to me," end quote. Ironhawk concluded by saying that he spoke for the Ogalallas and the Cheyennes. The Miniconjou and the Hunkpapas were in the country below and would have to be consulted separately. An undertaking had been made. The Ogalallas and Cheyennes would visit Red Cloud Agency in the spring and make peace with General Crook. More problematic issues, such as pony and arms confiscations, were passed over for the present, perhaps for debate with the later delegates requested by Ironhawk. The decision had been made without consulting Crazy Horse. Although no formal break had occurred with the nominal war chief, and both delegates and counselors were in pains to cite Crazy Horse's amenability to village consensus, the Northern Ogallala Council was now acting independently of him. The delegates remained in the village for several days, observing developments and awaiting news from Miles and Crazy Horse. Soon after the big council, runners from Crazy Horse arrived to invite all bands, quote, to meet him on Little Powder River, end quote. Crazy Horse had now heard reports of an embassy led by Spotted Tail and wished to finally decide the issue of peace or war at a full gathering of the Northern Nation. During the last week of February, Crazy Horse moved his 10 lodges east across the bleak divide into the upper valley of the Little Powder, camping amidst deep snows. As they traveled, they were joined by people from the main village, responding to Crazy Horse's invitation. By February 26, when 5 or more Major Mason's delegates departed for the agency, a total of 120 lodges, chiefly Ogalallas and Cheyennes, had gathered on the Little Powder. Near the forks of Powder River was the main village of Miniconjous and Sans Arcs, while Spotted Eagle's village was somewhere on the east side of the Lower Powder, a total of about 300 lodges or more. Crazy Horse may briefly have believed that he could recombine the majority of the Northern Nation, but late in February, new discouragements multiplied. Sitting Bull's response to the Ogallala invitation to a new rendezvous was flat, quote, "He was going north to the British possessions," end quote, and was unequivocally abandoning the hunting grounds. Faced with Sitting Bull's imminent departure, the Spotted Eagle village hurried across the frozen Yellowstone on February 26th and 27th, ascending Cedar Creek to join the Hunkpapa war chief in the upper Missouri Valley. About the same time, the main Miniconjou Sans Arc village moved east to the upper Little Missouri. Its intentions were unclear, but constituted a rejection of any grand council with Crazy Horse. Closer to home, the 110 lodges of Ogalallas and Cheyennes camped near Crazy Horse declined to form a united village with his tiny camp. As February turned into March, they organized for buffalo hunting, making 2 successful surrounds, but maintained their distance from the war chief. When Delegate Tallman left for the agency on March 4th, he observed only that, quote, quite a number of Indians were camped within about a day's march of Crazy Horse, end quote. Thus, even those Ogalallas who had responded to Crazy Horse's invitation were careful not to recharter a village in which he could reassert martial law through the Akichita. It seems likely that these people were already committed to surrender ahead of any council. Perhaps in an effort to mollify them, Crazy Horse made a reluctant undertaking to the delegates to, quote, come into the Red Cloud Agency and hold council during the spring, end quote. Even more discouraging, Crazy Horse's own kindred was beginning to fragment by the beginning of March. 4 lodges, evidently including that of his own father, Worm, left on a hunt for small game down the Little Powder. Most demoralizing of all, another 4 lodges turned south to join No Water in immediate surrender, arriving at the Red Cloud Agency on March 14th. This left Crazy Horse, the greatest Lakota war leader of the day, with a following of 2 lodges in the snowdrifts of the Little Powder. Every day brought news of fresh defections. On March 3rd, 4 horns crossed into Canada with 57 lodges of Hunkpapas, bringing the total in exile to 166 lodges. On March 4th, the deputation sent to Tongue River Cantonment arrived home in the main Cheyenne-Ogallala village on the Little Bighorn. Miles had offered them a home at Tongue River if they surrendered and agreed to enlist as scouts against hostile Indians. Leaving that question open, the council was satisfied enough to call a formal end to hostilities and had it, quote, cried through the camps that the war was over and that no more hostile expeditions would be allowed against the white man, end quote. A further arrival from the reservation brought significant news. Red Sack had reached Red Cloud Agency on February 23rd and had been permitted to return north, his fact-finding mission complete. He confirmed that Spotted Tail was mounting the biggest diplomatic initiative yet. The 2 Brûlé messengers from the north had arrived at his agency on February 10th with the news that the embassy led by Spotted Tail would net at least 100 surrendering lodges. Immediately, the Brûlé head chief went into intensive talks with Crook and won crucial, if off the record, concessions. The thorny topic of pony confiscations was finessed when Crook agreed that stock be surrendered to enlist Sioux Army scouts who would be free to redistribute them to their northern relatives. Most significantly, he promised to recommend to the president in Washington that the northern nation be assigned a separate reservation in the hunting grounds once all hostile bands had surrendered. Armed with these concessions, Spotted Tail had departed his agency on February 13th, taking the trail along the east edge of the Black Hills. With him were 250 Brûlé headmen, including band chiefs Swift Bear, Two Strike, and Iron Shell, a mule train of presents, and interpreters Jose Marival, Frank C. Boucher, and Tom Dorian. Crazy Horse was evidently apprehensive at the news. His father, Worm, was married to 2 sisters of Spotted Tail, women the war chief called Mother. In Lakota society, an uncle had compelling influence over his nephew. As the non-treaty coalition dissolved, an able politician like Spotted Tail might assimilate surrendering Indians into his own agency bands, marginalizing northern leaders. Aware of his own precarious position and unprepared to negotiate with his Brûlé uncle, Crazy Horse at last decided to set out on a vision quest to implore the cosmic powers for guidance for himself and for his people. Quote, there were things that he had to figure out, end quote, recalled his cousin, Nicholas Black Elk, in 1931. Nicholas Black Elk continued, quote, and he was wanting the spirits to guide him. He would then go back to his people and tell them what he had learned, end quote. About March 5th, Crazy Horse and his wife, Black Shawl, packed their teepee and struck into the snowy hills between the forks of Powder River. Black Shawl was probably already sick with a serious respiratory illness, so although childless, the couple was not alone. Also living in their teepee was Tall Bull, possibly a Miniconjou relative, and 2 women and 2 boys, useful to Black Shawl in running the lodge in her husband's absence. A second teepee of relatives accompanied them, all that was left of their 10 lodges that had followed the war chief from Tongue River. For almost 3 weeks, Crazy Horse disappeared among the snowy ridges between the Powder and Little Powder. Only one eyewitness account exists from those missing weeks. The Black Elk family was pressing on to surrender when, recalled Nicholas Black Elk, quote, we found Crazy Horse all alone on a creek with just his wife. He was a queer man. He had been queer all of this winter. Crazy Horse said to my father, Uncle, you might have noticed me, how I act, but it is for the good of my people that I am out alone. Out there, I am making plans, nothing but good plans for the good of my people. I don't care where the people go. They can go where they wish. There are lots of caves, and this shows that I cannot be harmed. This country is ours. Therefore, I am doing this, said Crazy Horse, end quote. For days at a time, carrying only a pipe and a tobacco bag, Crazy Horse left his teepee to seek the vision of guidance. Sheltering in caves only when late winter storms blasted the plains, he fasted and prayed, wept and begged the powers for the vision that could show him how best to preserve his people's lands. Still, the vision eluded him. He was an experienced quester, having dreamed of such powerful helpers as thunder and rock, the horse and the shadow. But this desperate effort yielded nothing. At endurance's end, he would return home and make purifying sweat baths, talking over his experiences with his relatives before leaving once more for the wilderness. As this private drama unfolded, pivotal public events centered on Spotted Tail's peace mission. On February 20th, the delegation met Eagle Pipe's 15 lodges at Box Elder Creek. Eagle Pipe told the Brule chief that he had left the camp of Red Horse, Spotted Elk, and White Eagle on the Little Missouri, en route for surrender at the Cheyenne River Agency. Spotted Tail hurried Eagle Pipe southward while the delegation pressed north of the Black Hills. Near where the Crows were killed, Butte, a landmark commanding the trail to Cheyenne River Agency, a base camp was established. Spotted Tail sent runners to all villages, scheduling a grand council on Little Powder River late in March. In doing this, he was adopting as his own Crazy Horse's aborted plan for a Northern Nation Council. In setting up his base camp, Spotted Tail also hoped to open early negotiations with the Miniconjou and Sans Arcs. By the first days of March, their main village, 136 lodges, had located on the Little Missouri River within 30 miles of Spotted Tail's camp. The village remained deeply divided over the issue of war. A part, cohering about the leadership of Roman Nose, was clearly keen to parley with the Brule delegation. Another faction, associated with Touch the Clouds, was perhaps awaiting word of the reception accorded to Spotted Elk upon surrender at Cheyenne River. A significant faction remained committed to war, however, and had unleashed a new offensive against the Black Hills miners. Beginning the second week of February, a 30-man war party struck panic into the mining settlements of the northern Black Hills, stealing horses and hundreds of cattle and sheep. Divided and hungry, the village continued to fragment in search of game, but 100 lodges moved near Spotted Tail's base camp and opened tentative negotiations by March 5th. Lame Deer's son, the Akechita leader Fast Bull, acted as spokesman. He said that the rest of the scattered village had been sent for, and when they came back, they would then have a grand council with Spotted Tail on the Little Missouri. Although Fast Bull assured the Brule chief that they would then take tobacco and make peace, he would not take the tobacco until they had the council. The Miniconjous and Sans Arcs remained divided, however. By the second week of March, a majority were gravitating back westward into the Powder River Valley, perhaps to await the Grand Council at Little Powder, some perhaps to monitor the continuing negotiations with Miles. Growing impatient, Spotted Tail himself struck west to reach the Little Missouri some 10 miles above the Short Pine Hills around March 13th. There, he found 30 crowded lodges. Nearby was a second hunting camp of 40 lodges. After the arrival of Spotted Tail, the two camps reunited in a single village. Comprising Miniconjou, Sans Arcs, and a few Ogalallas, the village nominated Touch the Clouds as its speaker. This son of late Miniconjou head chief Lonehorn was a regular visitor of the White River agencies. Probably by now aware that his brother Spotted Elk had been forced to surrender all his stock upon capitulation at Cheyenne River, Touch the Clouds was glad to hear Spotted Tail's assurances about his ponies and the qualified promise of a reservation in the north. After 5 days of talks held during fierce storms, Touch the Clouds promised to return with Spotted Tail to the Brule agency. With the storm blown out, the Brule delegation pressed westward to rejoin the main Miniconjou Sans Arc village, now located on the Little Powder about 15 miles above its mouth. Spotted Tail arrived there on March 20th, finding 100 crowded lodges, including a few Ogallala and Cheyenne visitors. The village had reorganized itself again and appointed as deciders Lame Deer, his son Fast Bull, Black Shield, and Roman Nose. This leadership was still polarized, and Spotted Tail had to deploy all his powers of persuasion in 6 days of intense debate. Both Lame Deer and Fast Bull insisted that peace was impossible as long as miners remained in the Black Hills and Miles's troops occupied the Lakota hunting grounds. To this point, Spotted Tail may have intimated that Miles's garrison would be closed once hostilities ended. Of the other deciders, Roman Nose was especially anxious for peace, according to interpreter Frank Boucher. Roman Nose had strong Brule connections, clearly influenced by the presence of his close associates Iron Shell and Swift Bear. Roman Nose favored immediate surrender at Spotted Tail agency. Black Shield, the remaining decider, was the key to village consensus. Long opposed to reservations and a staunch supporter of the war, just what persuaded Black Shield to finally swing his support behind Roman Nose is still unclear. Spotted Tail's promise of a new reservation in the hunting grounds and the assurances of nominal surrenders of stock coupled with deepening poverty of his people must have borne out their arguments of the peace party. By March 25th, a clear majority of people favored surrender at Spotted Tail, formalized in a consensus statement by the deciders. Roman Nose and Black Shield accepted Spotted Tail's tobacco and smoked the pipe of agreement. Lame Deer and Fastbull declined to smoke, but chose not to force the issue, stating only that they wished to remain and collect more Mini-Conjus who were scattered. There remained the unresolved issue of Crazy Horse and the Ogalallas. The largest Cheyenne and Ogallala village was still on Tongue River, awaiting the return of a second delegation to Miles. 6 Ogalallas from that village were visiting the Mini-Conjus and Sans Arcs as delegates to the Grand Council. Their leader, Black Twin's son, advised Spotted Tail that a new Ogallala rendezvous had been arranged at Bear Lodge Butte, modern-day Devil's Tower, near the northwest edge of the Black Hills. Those Ogalallas that had been on the Little Powder near Crazy Horse early in March had already moved to Bear Lodge. Their village, now on Tongue River, would soon join them. Black Twin's son assured Spotted Tail that, quote, so soon as he got to his people that he was going to move into the Red Cloud Agency with his family, end quote. Spotted Tail remained unconvinced. The Bear Lodge rendezvous constituted a rejection of his own Grand Council. Other reports indicated that the Ogalallas intended leaving their village at Bear Lodge, while the men alone traveled to Spotted Tail Agency to parley and trade their robes and furs, a traditional courtesy visit only. Mindful of Crook's stipulation that all northern Indians must surrender, Spotted Tail sent his last package of tobacco to Bear Lodge, warning the Ogalallas, quote, not to come in unless they brought their women and children, and that they must bring their wives and children with them, end quote. On Crazy Horse, above all, the Brule chief remained unsure. No satisfactory news had been heard from the war chief since he departed on his vision quest. Spotted Tail's own runners could not locate him. His father, Worm, had arrived in the Little Powder village with his 4 lodges. Worm told his brother-in-law that Crazy Horse, quote, was out hunting by himself, end quote, but insisted that he would make peace and shake hands through his father the same as if he did it himself. Worm presented a pony to Jose Marival as a token that Crazy Horse makes peace. Still concerned that Crazy Horse was deliberately avoiding him, Spotted Tail detailed 1 Brule warrior and an agency Ogallala to take tobacco and search for the war chief. Then on March 26th, Spotted Tail turned eastward. Up to 90 lodges followed him. As well as the Mini-Conjus and Sans Arcs, Worm's small party of Ogalallas opted for surrender. Only 10 or 15 lodges chose to remain with Lame Deer and Fastbull. Despite wretched trails, swollen streams, and the exhausted stock, Spotted Tail forced the pace to cover 70 miles in 2 days, reuniting with Touch the Clouds camp late on March 27th. Here, a single village organization was reestablished, seating Mini-Conjus Touch the Clouds and Roman Nose, with the Sans Arcs High Bear and Red Bear as deciders. The village then started south at a more leisurely pace. After crossing the Belle Fourche on April 2nd, Spotted Tail felt confident enough to leave the village and hurried into his agency with the news of the imminent surrender. Even as Spotted Tail turned east from the Powder River drainage, Ogalallas and Cheyennes from the main village were approaching the valley from the west. Dissatisfied at reports of the second delegation to Miles, they were headed for the new rendezvous at Bear Lodge. Probably on March 2nd, they arrived on Powder River some 20 miles above the Little Powder. Awaiting them at the campground was a familiar teepee. Crazy Horse had at last returned from his vision quest and, with Spotted Tail's departure, seemed ready to resume his role as war chief. An Ogallala council was called. The delegates to Miles had left Tongue River Cantonment on the 23rd and were doubtless present. Little Hawk, Worm's brother, was the ranking Ogallala delegate, with Hard to Kill, another relation of Crazy Horse's, representing the Hunkpatila band of Akachita. Four Crows and Akachita in the Sorebacks band had also visited Miles. They reported that both Hump and his brother, the Miniconjou headman Horse Road, with 7 Cheyennes, had remained at Tongue River Cantonment as hostages guaranteeing the surrender of their relatives. Nevertheless, their report discouraged any Ogallala capitulation to Miles. A clear consensus prevailed for negotiations at the Red Cloud Agency, but expectations were high that Crazy Horse would have a significant contribution to make the council. Instead, the war chief sat quietly through the debate. It was left to Ironhawk to once more crystallize the consensus position. Quote, "You see, all the people here are in rags. They all need clothing. We might as well go in." End quote. Crazy Horse indicated his weary, tacit approval, and the council closed. Crazy Horse's silence actually betrayed his continued indecision. 3 weeks of his vision quest had left him gaunt, but unenlightened. If the powers had granted him any vision, its significance was unclear, committing him to no definite course of action. That was demonstrated immediately after the council, when messengers arrived at his teepee with the astonishing news that Lame Deer had remained on the Little Powder that morning, rejecting Spotted Tail's tobacco and planning to leave on a buffalo hunt on Tongue River the following day. Instantly galvanized, Crazy Horse determined to join the Miniconjou chief. That evening, he confided in his old comrade, He-Dog, who unsuccessfully tried to talk him out of the plan. On the morning of March 27th, as the Ogallala village prepared to press on to Bear Lodge, Crazy Horse departed to join Lame Deer. Crazy Horse clearly felt that Lame Deer's stance was nearest to his own. He still wished to keep the Northern Coalition alive and retain Lakota hunting grounds in the Powder River country. Lame Deer's hunt offered the last opportunity for that course of action. Crazy Horse may have calculated that his dramatic departure would cause a break in the Ogallala village, with the core winter roamers choosing to follow their war chief. If so, his hopes were cruelly dashed. Only one other Ogallala lodge, that of the eternally defiant Low Dog, decided to join Lame Deer. About 10 lodges of Hump's Miniconjous, flouting their chief's order to surrender to Miles, may have followed Crazy Horse down the Powder. Once united with Lame Deer, the reality of the situation soon became plain to Crazy Horse. Lame Deer had no strategic aim, stating simply that he wished to make one more buffalo hunt. Then he might return to his camp at Cheyenne River. A few more irreconcilables gravitated toward Lame Deer's camp. At Bear Butte, 30 lodges of disillusioned Miniconjous and Sans Arcs broke away from the village bound for Spotted Tail. Several lodges of Hunkpapas appeared from Sitting Bull with more depressing news. Camped in the Missouri River bottoms 45 miles above Fort Peck, Sitting Bull's village had been caught by a sudden thaw on the morning of March 17th. His camp destroyed, the Hunkpapa leader had finally withdrawn toward the Canadian border. Peaked at only 63 lodges, wavering between defiance and the nostalgic wish for one last hunt before surrender, the Lame Deer camp offered no military solution to Crazy Horse's quandary. In despair, perhaps concerned by his wife's weakening condition, Crazy Horse finally turned back to rejoin the Ogallalas. Chastened with no announcement, he rode quietly into the Ogallala village at Bear Lodge around April 3rd. His dream of a revived coalition to hold the Powder River country was over. After the frantic activity of March, the pace of Crazy Horse's life slowed abruptly. The village took time to regroup, resting and recouping stock. After 2 months of dispersal, It reorganized into a single camp circle of up to 155 lodges, mostly Ogalallas, but including about 25 lodges of Brulés, 10 of the Miniconjou, and 5 of the Sans Arcs. 4 new deciders were seated to administer affairs: Little Hawk, Little Big Man, Old Hawk, and Big Road. They selected He-Dog to act as head Akichita. Hunting parties departed, small family groups scattering to forage in the terrain still blasted by the storms and mired by the thaw. At first, Crazy Horse seemed listless, despairing. Quote, "This country is ours, therefore I am doing this," end quote. He had told the Black Elk family that a month before. Now he seemed to believe that all is lost, that the country is lost. News continued to confirm his despair. The main Miniconjou Sans Arc village surrendered at Spotted Tail Agency on April 14th. Reports from the north located Sitting Bull's village in the Milk River Valley within 50 miles of the Canadian line. Numbering 135 lodges of Hunkpapas, Sans Arcs, Miniconjous, and a few Ogalallas, they would finally cross the Medicine Line into Grandmother's Land during the first week of May, bringing the total of refugee Lakotas in Canada to about 300 lodges. Closer to home, the Cheyenne resistance had finally collapsed. When the Ogalallas pressed on to Bear Lodge, the Cheyennes had remained in camp on Powder River for an intense round of councils. The delegates from Miles prevailed upon some 300 people, including 43 lodges of Cheyennes and 4 lodges of Hump's closest Miniconjou relatives, to surrender at Tongue River Cantonment. These Cheyennes, including war leaders like Ice and Two Moons, had been the core of Crazy Horse's Cheyenne supporters during the winter soldiering regime. A contingent of 60 Southern Cheyennes rode through the village and announced that they would turn themselves in at their own agency in Indian Territory, modern Oklahoma. Most, however, were swayed by the arrival of 7 Cheyenne messengers from Red Cloud and their assurance of good treatment. When the Chiefs Council announced that every Cheyenne could choose his place of surrender, the majority, almost 600 people, opted for Red Cloud. 2 small parties decided to stay out, one joining Lame Deer, but for the Cheyennes, the war was over. The main village, following Chiefs Dull Knife and Standing Elk, hurried on past Bear Lodge early in April. Living in wretched tents made from gunny sacks and old blankets, horse poor and hungry, many Cheyennes still nursed their grievance against Crazy Horse. They made no secret that upon surrender, many warriors would volunteer as army scouts for a spring campaign against the Ogallala war chief. Yet as the days passed, Crazy Horse seemed to have undergone a change of heart. In private talks with agency envoys and Ogallala headmen, he mulled over Crook's plan to seek a separate reservation for the Northern Indians. Little Big Man, Big Road, and other headmen had heard that the presidential election of 1876 had placed a new Great Father, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, in Washington. Crazy Horse had always rejected the kinship status of the president, but word that Hayes was an old Civil War comrade of Crook's boosted confidence that the general could deliver on his promises. Slowly, Crazy Horse began to formulate a more measured response to the offer of peace. One development that may have clinched his decision was that Agency Ogallala Chief's Young Man Afraid of His Horses, American Horse, and Yellow Bear had opened a dialogue with Colonel Mackenzie at Camp Robinson. In return for locating their 3 bands, over 200 lodges, and a new reserve on Tongue River, they promised to make peace with neighboring tribes and work as scouts against hostile Indians. Mackenzie undertook the report favorably up to the chain of command. The assurance that agency and Northern Ogalallas could cooperate in seeking a reserve in the hunting grounds may have gone far to convince Crazy Horse that an honorable peace could be won for his people. In a momentous private decision, the war chief decided he would gamble upon Crook's promise and go to Red Cloud Agency. And in a startling shift towards pragmatism, he even approved a provisional agency site high up on Tongue River, near the site of modern Sheridan, Wyoming. Finally, at a big council held in his honor, Crazy Horse delivered his considered response to the latest round of agency delegates. Rising briefly from his seat, Crazy Horse spoke tersely and simply. stating, quote, "This day I have untied my horse's tail and laid my gun aside, and I have sat down," end quote. The envoys pressed him to order the camp moved, but the war chief demurred, stating, quote, "Not until I rest, then I will be willing to go. But before I go, give lots of ammunition to my people. I have set a place for my people that will be the reservation," end quote. At this or another council held within a few days, Crazy Horse expanded on his change of heart. He cited the new great father in Washington, quote, "who was a very good man and who would probably do more for the Indians than any who had preceded him," end quote. The very fact that Crazy Horse conceded kinship status to the president was a radical departure. The decision had at last been made. 6 northern messengers were sent to Red Cloud with positive word. The village would leave Bear Lodge and cross the Belfourche River on April 16th, hoping to arrive at the Red Cloud Agency by April 28th. Meanwhile, at Camp Robinson, the Army had continued to monitor ambivalent reports about Crazy Horse's intentions. From statements by agency Ogalallas, Mackenzie concluded that Crazy Horse was unlikely to surrender, and that the winter roaming segments of the Ogalallas and Cheyennes will almost certainly stay out. Such an eventuality would require a spring campaign for which Crook and Mackenzie must implement immediate plans. Anxious to confirm Crazy Horse's intentions, Crook conferred with Red Cloud himself about April 10th. The Ogallala Agency head chief had been out of favor with Crook since the previous fall, when the general disposed him and appointed Spotted Tail nominal chief of both White River agencies. Both Crook and subsequently his chief of Indian Scouts, Lieutenant William P. Clark, played on Red Cloud's insecurity. After 3 days of talks in which Clark tacitly promised Red Cloud's restoration by appointing him first sergeant of the Scouts, the Ogallala chief formed an 80-man Ogallala delegation to meet Crazy Horse. Led by Red Cloud and band chiefs Yellow Bear, Slow Bull, and lately surrendered No Water, accompanied by interpreters Antoine Ledoux, Antoine Janus, and Jose Marival, the party struck north on April 13th, leading an obligatory pack train of rations and presents. Within 3 days of Red Cloud's departure, the runners from the northern village began to appear at the agency with the positive news that the Army had awaited so long. Crazy Horse was coming in. Up the trail, Red Cloud's party also fielded encouraging news. The village indeed broke camp on April 16th, making its first overnight stop on Bear Lodge Creek, on the south side of the Belfourche. With Akachita restrictions lifted, 3 lodges of Brulés immediately departed for Spotted Tail Agency, traveling much faster than the main village, which was delayed in awaiting the return of hunting parties. Its schedule further slowed by very rainy weather and the rail-thin stock. The village was in slow progress. But about April 20th, the van met Red Cloud's party. Red Cloud's herald had a simple message. All is well. Have no fear. Come on in. Nervousness was inevitable as agency leaders and northern Ogalallas met, but Red Cloud handled the amenities well. He succeeded in assuring Crazy Horse and the other leaders that no punishment would follow their surrender, no academic issue, for Kiowa, Comanche, and Southern Cheyenne leaders in the Red River War had been sent to imprisonment in Florida only 2 years before. He carefully explained the procedure of surrendering stock. It would all be given up to the agency Ogallala Scouts and later redistributed among the northern village. The village herd, although in poor shape, was exceptionally large at 2,200 head. Keen to reaffirm their kinship status with agency relatives, 500 head were given as presents by the northern people during the march south. On firearms, Red Cloud could offer no good news. All would have to be given up, he explained, perhaps sniping at Spotted Tail, who seemed to have claimed the Army would demand only captured weapons. Here was a flashpoint for trouble, but Crazy Horse merely remarked, quote, "All right, let them have them," end quote. If any leader ever needed careful handling, it was Crazy Horse, but the diplomatic Red Cloud was equal to the occasion. Short Bull recalled, quote, "We all went into the agency in good spirits. Was no bad feelings among the chiefs or anybody," end quote. Crazy Horse's surprise tractability can only be explained by his new commitment to a negotiated solution to his people's predicament. Red Cloud explained that a delegation of Ogallala leaders would be invited to counsel with the president in Washington about Crook's scheme for a reservation in the hunting grounds. Although he had refused to represent the Northern Ogallalas on a similar delegation prior to the war, Crazy Horse now immediately agreed to go to Washington. Welcoming the opportunity to lay Northern Nation's case before the new Great Father, he questioned Red Cloud and his comrades closely about the protocol and the practicalities of such trips. The difficult details of surrender worked out, it remained only a full-dressed feast and council to make a public announcement to the village of what lay ahead. Hosted by Crazy Horse and the Northern leadership, Red Cloud and the agency delegates were formally invited to the council teepee. Rising from his seat, Crazy Horse personally spread a buffalo robe for Red Cloud to sit upon. Then, in the most conciliatory gesture yet, he removed his own hair-fringed war shirt, symbolic of his status as principal war chief of the Ogallalas, and placed it over Red Cloud's shoulders. Crazy Horse thus transferred symbolic supremacy in the village to Red Cloud, and tacitly accepted the primacy of the agency Ogallala's tribal organization over that of the northern village. It was a startling gesture of conciliation at the end of this winter of unprecedented polarization and hardship, when Crazy Horse had taken a coercive potential of Lakota society further than any leader in history. Although an effort of extraordinary will, he had sought to maintain the Northern Coalition as a military force all winter, keeping up village strengths that were unmatched even for summer operations. Repeatedly, he had tightened the bonds of Akecheta control, normally relaxed after each major hunt or war party, over a people increasingly war-weary. In unprecedented fashion, he had sought to impose his personal control even beyond his own Ogallala camp circle, marching boldly into other villages, even to private lodges, to persuade, to cajole, or even inflict punishment, whatever was necessary to maintain the war front and save the hunting grounds of his people. But now it was over. With military occupations used up and exile in Canada unacceptable, only diplomacy remained. Warily, Crazy Horse accepted the inevitable and agreed to surrender and then open negotiations with military and civil authorities over a reservation in the hunting grounds. As the deciders issued their orders to strike the teepees and start the final march to Red Cloud Agency, Crazy Horse was determined to pursue that negotiated solution. With newfound confidence in his agency peers and trust in the promises made by General Crook, he rode to the head of the column and started it southward, out of the hunting grounds. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to learn more about our podcast, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform every other week. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.